In today's video, we'll be looking at 5 real-life incidents where a love for snakes proved deadly, from a lone collector struggling in the Louisiana bayou to a crowded county fair in Tennessee that ended in chaos. But first, in the quiet of an Arizona garage, one man's late-night obsession with exotic snakes would become his fatal mistake. It was August 15, 2014. It was a hot summer evening in Scottsdale, Arizona. Douglas Jackson lived in a nice neighborhood where most people knew him as the guy who took pictures of animals for magazines. What they didn't know was that Douglas had a secret obsession. For 20 years, he had been collecting the most dangerous snakes he could find, including rattlesnakes and coral snakes that could kill with one bite. He had over 30 of them living in glass boxes stacked in his garage, and though neighbors complained about strange smells and the fire department warned him about the mess and poor airflow, Douglas didn't care, because he thought he was an expert. He believed his years of experience handling snakes and his thin leather gloves would keep him safe. The glass tanks were stacked 3 high, wobbling slightly when anyone walked by. Water from cleaning the tanks had spilled all over the concrete floor, making it slippery. There was barely enough room to walk between the tanks, and definitely not enough space to handle dangerous snakes safely. That evening in August, Douglas had a plan. He wanted to take pictures of his newest baby snakes. These little ones had unusual colors that he thought would look great in his personal photo collection. He set up his camera equipment and arranged special lights to get the perfect shots. As he worked, some of the rattlesnakes started acting nervously. They lifted their heads and made soft hissing sounds when he walked past their tanks. Their tongues flicked in and out, tasting the air. A few of them coiled their bodies tight, ready to strike. These were warning signs that Douglas should have noticed, but he was too focused on his photography project to pay attention. Douglas decided he wanted to photograph 2 snakes together. He reached into one of the tanks to pick up a rattlesnake, then bent down toward another. Trying to hold both snakes at once was reckless. Any experienced handler would never risk it, but Douglas, confident in his years of experience, underestimated just how quickly things could go wrong. It was a terrible mistake. The first rattlesnake twisted angrily in Douglas's grip and struck his wrist, fangs sinking through his thin gloves. He cried out in pain and stumbled backward, landing in a puddle of water on the slick garage floor. His feet slid out from under him and he crashed into one of the smaller glass tanks. The tank shattered, sending shards across the floor, and a coral snake tumbled out, startled by the noise and sudden movement. It struck defensively, biting Douglas on the side of his neck before retreating. Each time he jerked or shifted, the snake briefly struck again, always defending itself rather than chasing him. In the confusion, 4 snakes each delivered 1 or 2 defensive strikes as Douglas stumbled across the wet floor, then quickly retreated to corners of the garage. A young coral snake bit his arm, while a large rattlesnake struck his leg before coiling briefly and sliding away. The rattlesnake bites burned immediately, and within minutes his skin was swelling, making it painful and difficult to move. The coral snake's neurotoxin worked more slowly. At first, Douglas noticed tingling in his lips and numbness in his fingertips. Several minutes later, his eyelids began to droop, and his hands felt heavier. The weakness spread faster than Douglas expected, leaving him unable to keep his balance within minutes. As he struggled to push himself upright, his speech turned slurred, and his breathing became shallow. Every movement he made risked provoking more defensive strikes. The camera lights bounced off the broken glass, reflecting the snake's bright colors and throwing chaotic shadows across the garage, making the whole scene feel like it was spinning around him. Across the street, a neighbor heard a crash, followed by the sound of glass scattering across concrete. She looked toward the garage and saw brief flashes of light, then Douglas's silhouette stumbling and jerking violently, as though he were fighting invisible attackers. Realizing something was terribly wrong, she grabbed her phone and called 911. When the firefighters and paramedics arrived a few minutes later, they found Douglas lying still on the concrete floor. He wasn't breathing. Snake bite marks covered his wrist, arm, and neck, where the poison had entered his body. 4 snakes had escaped from their broken tanks and were hiding in the corners of the garage. Paramedics had to wait until animal control secured the loose snakes before reaching Douglas, costing precious minutes that might have saved him. The garage was a complete mess. Broken glass, spilled water, and damaged camera equipment covered the floor. Some cameras were still recording, and investigators later reviewed the footage. It showed the rattlesnakes coiling defensively and striking briefly, and the coral snake delivering short, defensive strikes before retreating. The video confirmed the dangers Douglas had ignored for years. All of Douglas's snakes were removed and sent to licensed facilities with trained handlers. The garage was treated as a biohazard site because of the venom, blood, and broken glass on the floor. Cleanup crews wore protective gear as they disinfected surfaces, removed contaminated debris, and safely disposed of Douglas's damaged photography equipment. From a crowded Arizona garage to the jungles of Borneo, people who weren't careful with venomous snakes faced the same dangers. Another man learned how deadly these rare snakes could be, this time in a distant rainforest. It was May 22, 2016. Morning fog covered the trees along the Kinabatangan River in Borneo. Arif Hamza was 32 years old and had been leading nature tours along the river for almost 10 years. Other tour guides knew him as the man who could find rare animals, especially snakes, and take pictures of them for magazines around the world. People respected his skills and knowledge, but Arif often ignored basic safety rules because he believed his years of experience made him safer than he really was. That morning, his goal was to find a rare green pit viper snake for a magazine job, and he loved taking pictures of wildlife so much that he often took risks other people would never take. The area along the river was muddy from rain the night before, with water sitting in small pools everywhere, and wet leaves making the ground slippery under Arif's boots. The forest was so thick that sunlight only came through in thin beams, creating dark patches that hid holes, underwater branches, and other things that could trip someone. This silence made things feel tense, like something dangerous might be hiding in the mud or under the leaves. Green pit vipers are small but very poisonous snakes. When they bite, they inject strong poison that causes pain, swelling, and bruising right away. Later, people can feel sick, dizzy, and have problems with their blood. These snakes usually stay very still and wait to catch their food. They do not chase people, but if someone bothers them or makes them feel threatened, they will bite to protect themselves. Earlier that morning, Arif had ignored warnings from local park rangers about recent flooding along the riverbanks. Tourists had been told to stay on the safe walking paths and not go too close to the muddy edges near the water. There were small signs that animals lived in the area: broken branches, old snakeskin, and small dents in the mud. Arif was so focused on finding the snake for his pictures that he ignored these warning signs. He moved closer to the water and got down on his knees to position his camera. To steady himself, he planted one foot behind him on the muddy bank. He found the green pit viper curled up under some tree roots. Its bright green skin blended in with the leaves around it. Leaning forward for a better angle, his foot slipped into a small water-filled hole, and he lost his balance. His hand brushed against the snake by accident. The pit viper struck once through a soft spot in Arif's leather boot, injecting venom deep into his lower leg. Pain exploded up his calf, and as he stumbled back, the snake struck once more before retreating into the roots. Arif fell partly into the shallow river, the mud sucking at his boots and making it hard to stand. Within minutes, his legs swelled and turned dark purple. Each time he tried to shift his weight, the pain and slick mud made him slip again, leaving him splashing in the water. His camera tipped over and sank, and the tourists panicked, some slipping on the bank, others running for help. Arif's strength drained quickly. The swelling and pain made it nearly impossible to move, and dizziness from venom and shock left him too weak to stay upright. He collapsed forward into the muddy water, unable to push himself back up. By the time other guides arrived, Arif had lost consciousness face down in the muddy water, and the shallow current had already claimed him. The pit viper had already disappeared back into the roots by the time the area was secure. Tourists later shared videos and photos that showed how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. Tourists later shared their photos and videos, which showed how quickly the situation spiraled out of control. Local authorities recovered a waterproof camera case that preserved the moment of his slip and first strike. The incident was covered by a local wildlife blog, which warned of the dangers of leaving safe paths near snake habitats. Tour companies changed their rules soon after, banning solo photography near riverbanks and requiring guides to carry protective gear and maintain constant contact with their groups. The recovered footage was later used in training sessions as a sobering reminder of how quickly one mistake can turn deadly in the wild. From the wild rivers of Borneo to a controlled university lab in Massachusetts, venomous snakes proved deadly even in supposedly safe conditions. Another overconfident handler discovered that knowledge alone couldn't protect him from one fatal mistake. It was April 12, 2017. The biology lab sat on the edge of a small university campus in Massachusetts. Inside the lab, the air smelled like cleaning products and warm glass tanks, and the building was almost empty that morning. Michael Lawson was 24 years old and a graduate student who studied snakes. He had loved snakes since he was a little boy and joined the university program that studied poisonous snakes, partly to get field experience, and partly because he was excited to work with dangerous animals. Michael was careful with his notes and experiments, but but he believed that to really understand how an animal behaved, you had to get close enough to see how it reacted. His teachers sometimes warned him that being careful in the lab was required, but Michael trusted his own judgment. That semester, Michael had been working on a project about how young cobras and vipers defended themselves, which meant he had to watch them carefully during feeding time. He wrote down things like how often they flicked their tongues, how far they could strike, and how they sat after eating. He had access to several young monocled cobras that were about 2 feet long but could already give dangerous bites. The lab had strict rules requiring students to wear 2 pairs of gloves, use long metal tongs to move water dishes, and never open a cage unless another student was there. But Michael sometimes worked alone on quiet mornings, so he could get his data without being interrupted. The lab was a narrow room with glass tanks along 2 walls. Each tank had a label showing what kind of snake lived inside and when it should be fed. A metal table in the center held notebooks, feeding tongs, and a locked box that contained medicine for snake bites. The room felt calm, but had a tense feeling underneath. The snakes inside were alert, and some were coiled near the front of their tanks. Several had been handled earlier that week for health checks, which made them more defensive than usual. The faint rattling sound from a young viper in the corner reminded anyone who entered that these were not classroom pets, but a collection of living, dangerous animals. Monocled cobras are small but very fast. They can strike in fractions of a second. Their poison mainly affects muscles and breathing. Symptoms can start within minutes if the bite is bad enough. A person might get droopy eyelids, slurred speech, and weakness before their body becomes paralyzed. Young snakes might inject smaller amounts of poison, but even one bite can kill someone without fast treatment. The lab kept antidote medicine, but only trained people could give it under supervision. That morning, Michael wore his usual thin lab gloves, but skipped the rule about using tongs or a hook to move objects inside the enclosure. He wanted a clear view for his camera and thought it would be faster to use his hands. He set up his notebook and a small camera on a tripod to record how the cobra acted during feeding. When he opened the latch on the tank, the cobra inside spread its hood slightly, showing it was alert. Michael tapped the side of the tank gently with a metal tong, a normal way to see if the snake was ready to eat. Then he reached in to move the water dish by hand. The sudden movement startled the snake. It struck once, fast, catching his wrist just above where the glove ended, then retreated to the back of the enclosure, hood still spread. The pain hit him right away. It was sharp enough to make him jerk his arm back and hit the edge of the tank. A viper in a nearby tank started rattling in response. Michael grabbed a piece of gauze from the table and pressed it against the bite marks, but his hand was already starting to shake. He tried to close the tank lid, but accidentally knocked over a plastic feeding tub that held mice. The tub hit the floor with a hollow clatter, and the squealing of scared mice set the room on edge. The other snakes coiled tighter and struck at the glass walls of their enclosures. Minutes passed quickly. Michael pulled out his phone with shaking hands, but his grip kept slipping as he tried to dial for help. He pulled the anti-venom kit from the lockbox, but couldn't keep his grip steady enough to use it. When his lab partner arrived, they found him sitting on the floor, leaning against the work table, his breathing uneven. They stayed close and kept talking to him, trying to stop him from slipping into unconsciousness while calling for emergency help. His eyelids kept dropping, and his hands moved clumsily over the gauze on his wrist. Camera footage and witness accounts later showed him still holding pressure on the wound while knocking over nearby tools with his other hand. His movements slowed until he could no longer stay upright. By the time emergency responders reached the lab, his breathing was shallow and irregular. He stopped responding as they moved him from the floor. Afterward, the lab fell silent. His tripod camera was still running, capturing the enclosure, the brief strike, and the sound of equipment being knocked over. His open notebook remained on the bench, marked with smears where he had pressed his wrist. The university held a quiet memorial and released a short statement about the dangers of venomous snake handling. Outside the department, little was said. No headlines, no press coverage, just a single campus newspaper article that mentioned the loss. In the following weeks, the lab made quiet but permanent changes. Double locks were added to every venomous enclosure, and new handling tools replaced the ones Michael had used. Working alone in the lab was banned entirely. His footage and field notes were archived and later shown to new students during safety training, a reminder that even a careful researcher can miss one step, and that step can be the last. From a controlled Massachusetts University lab to the unpredictable Louisiana swamps, venomous snakes continued to claim lives in different ways. Another overconfident handler discovered that isolation and overestimating your skills could be just as deadly as ignoring safety rules. It was August 19, 2017, on Bayou Teche in southern Louisiana. The swamp was still in the early morning heat, and the cypress trees and hanging moss made the waterway look peaceful. but the air held a heavy silence that warned how quickly things could change. Tom Redding was 42 years old and had lived in St. Martin Parish his whole life. People in the area knew him as the guy who loved snakes. He had a shed behind his house with glass tanks holding several harmless snake species. He often told neighbors he was working on a personal project about snake behavior. He wrote down when and where he saw different types of snakes. Tom was experienced enough to recognize most snakes just by looking at them. His confidence made him ignore warnings from other people about the dangers of catching snakes in remote waters. He usually went out alone because he preferred the quiet. That Saturday, he put his small flat-bottomed aluminum boat in the water just after sunrise. He brought his phone in a waterproof bag, a camera on a small stand, and a net for catching specimens. He did not bring another person, a life jacket, or a first aid kit, except for a small bottle of antiseptic. The day before, he had told a friend he wanted to find a cottonmouth snake for closer observation. He believed they were less aggressive than most people thought. The bayou was narrow in some places and wider in others, with tall grass along the edges. Insects buzzed over the water, and birds called across the swamp. Tree branches under the water scraped his boat's bottom, and fish or frogs splashed occasionally. The air was still except for the loud humming of cicadas. Cottonmouths, also called water moccasins, are thick-bodied, poisonous snakes that live in southern swamps. Adult snakes grow 2 to 4 feet long and are good swimmers. When threatened, they often coil up and open their mouths wide to show the white inside, but they can also strike quickly if someone gets too close. Their poison breaks down tissue and causes fast swelling and severe pain. Most bites can be survived with quick medical care, but without treatment, they can be deadly. Tom guided his boat to a shaded bend where he had seen snakes sunning themselves before. A dark shape moved along a log at the water's edge with its head just above the surface. He thought it was a medium-sized cottonmouth, exactly what he had hoped to record on camera. Tom steadied his camera and leaned far over the side of his flat-bottomed boat with his net, trying to reach the snake. Flat-bottomed boats are very sensitive to shifts in weight, and leaning over the side can easily cause them to take on water. His weight made the boat tip forward, and the bottom scraped against an underwater log, causing the boat to tilt sharply. Water rushed over the edge and into the boat, and Tom struggled to keep his balance. Each time he tried to climb back into the boat, it rocked back and forth again. This made him more tired and weak, and he could not get control of the situation. People on a nearby dock saw splashing as he grabbed the boat's side, trying to climb back in. Instead of swimming away, the cottonmouth bit Tom defensively whenever his leg got too close. Each time he splashed or moved near it, the snake struck once, then backed away to the log. Within minutes, witnesses could see his legs swelling and blood clouding the water. He slipped under several times, pushing himself back up, but the effort was draining his strength. The fishermen on shore called for help, but the boat was several hundred yards from the nearest launch, and the shallow water made it hard to reach him quickly. For over 20 minutes, Tom clung to the swamped boat, his kicks growing weaker. The combination of pain, swelling, blood loss, and constant struggling against the unstable boat drained his strength faster than normal, leaving him too weak to keep swimming. From shore, people saw his body sag lower in the water until he could barely keep his head above the surface. Witnesses later said it seemed like exhaustion and blood loss, rather than the venom alone, made it impossible for him to stay afloat. By the time help reached him, Tom had stopped moving and was face down against the side of his partially swamped boat. When his body was pulled from the water, he still had one hand hooked over the edge, as if he had tried to climb back in until the very last moment. His phone was found sealed in its waterproof bag. The camera stand had fallen during the struggle, and the recovered memory card contained several minutes of footage showing the snake near the log and the moment the boat tipped, but nothing after Tom went into the water. Most people in the area remembered seeing Tom's boat sitting low in the swamp that morning, a quiet reminder of where things had gone wrong. Tom had spent years studying and catching snakes, thinking his experience would keep him safe. But in the end, one small mistake in a dangerous place cost him his life. The cottonmouth was just acting like cottonmouths do when they feel threatened. It was not the snake's fault, but the result of one man's overconfidence and the risks he took by going alone into the swamp. Whether in the solitude of a Louisiana swamp or amid the crowds of a Tennessee county fair, overconfidence around venomous snakes continued to prove deadly. Another handler discovered that even experience couldn't replace caution when safety rules were ignored during public demonstrations. It was September 8, 2018, in rural Bradley County, Tennessee. The annual county fair had brought families, farmers, and animal lovers from all over the area, and the animal show tents were busy with activity. Melanie Rhodes was 36 years old and a well-known exotic snake breeder who worked with vipers and cobras. She had been breeding reptiles for over 10 years and often went to county fairs to show her animals and teach people about them. People in the area knew her as calm and skilled, and she was proud that she could handle even the most venomous snakes with her bare hands. This fair was a chance to find new buyers for her upcoming baby snakes, and she wanted to make a strong impression on collectors and judges. Melanie had driven in from her small breeding facility just outside Chattanooga. She brought several harmless pythons, a pair of rattlesnakes, and one spectacled cobra that lived in a locked clear box. Throughout the day, she did short shows with the less dangerous snakes while explaining how to feed them and care for them properly. By evening, the crowd grew larger, and people pressed close to her table, eager to see the cobra. Despite the noise and heat, Melanie decided to end the day with a hands-on show. She wanted to prove that her cobra was calm and manageable, a demonstration that could set her apart from other breeders. The reptile tent was warm and slightly humid, with strings of light bulbs hanging overhead. Kids crowded near the front of Melanie's table, standing on their toes to see better, while older collectors leaned in with cameras ready. The atmosphere felt tense but excited, like the moment before fireworks go off. The spectacled cobra she had brought was just over 5 feet long and was known to be quick-tempered, especially when handled in noisy places. Spectacled cobras are very defensive snakes that can raise the front part of their body and strike multiple times very quickly. While not as large as king cobras, their venom is neurotoxic and can cause paralysis or respiratory failure within hours, if not treated quickly. Experienced handlers usually use hooks or tongs to keep a safe distance, but Melanie preferred handling them directly to show she was in control. There had been warnings earlier in the day. A local game warden had walked through the reptile tent and reminded people showing animals about state rules requiring barriers between venomous reptiles and the public. Several handlers used clear plastic shields or kept snakes in display cages, but Melanie's table had no guard in front. As she unlocked the cage, a neighboring exhibitor warned her about the crowd pressing too close, but she waved it off because she was focused on her demonstration. Melanie slid the lid off the cage and gently tapped the snake with her hook to get it to come forward. The cobra came out slowly, spreading its hood and swaying slightly. It was clearly agitated by the noise around it. Instead of pinning the snake with her hook as most handlers would, Melanie confidently grabbed it just behind the head with her bare hand. Witnesses later said she smiled as she held it up and began talking about the species. The first strike came so fast that most people barely noticed until she jerked back. The cobra's fangs sank into her wrist, leaving 2 small punctures that began to bead with blood. The sudden pain caused her grip to loosen, and the snake slid partially out of her hand. Startled, it struck defensively a second time at her forearm before sliding to the table. Each strike was a reaction to her handling, not an attempt to chase her. The crowd panicked, knocking over cages and stumbling back. Children cried, and one of the judges shouted for space to be cleared. On the sawdust floor, the cobra flared its hood and struck at anything that moved within reach, remaining defensive but not predatory. Melanie staggered on the stool, trying to maintain control while reaching for the hook, her hold still shaky and her wrist throbbing from the bites. Paramedics were called. Every minute mattered, but the nearest ambulance had to move slowly through the crowded fairgrounds. Minutes after the bites, Melanie's speech became unclear, and her hands trembled uncontrollably. Within minutes, witnesses saw her start to tremble and lose coordination, much faster than most had expected. She had trouble staying upright on the stool because her legs felt weak and unsteady. Her chest rose in short, shallow bursts as the paralysis crept upward, leaving her unable to draw a full breath. She finally collapsed to her side, unable to speak, her body struggling for air as the neurotoxic venom took hold. When paramedics reached her, she had already gone limp. They immediately began assisted ventilation with a bag valve mask and provided oxygen as they rushed her to the ambulance. Despite their efforts, her pulse weakened during transport. At the hospital, anti-venom was administered, but it was too late. Doctors pronounced her dead shortly after arrival. County officials later installed stricter rules for venomous animal shows, requiring physical barriers and banning direct handling during demonstrations. The spectacled cobra was transferred to a university research facility for study. Melanie's table was fitted with clear plastic the following year, and fairgoers were kept several feet away from venomous reptiles. Her death became a warning story in the reptile community, reminding handlers that even experienced professionals can make fatal mistakes when safety rules are ignored. Thanks for tuning in. If you're ready, the next story is waiting on the end screen. Another encounter with the unexpected on Animal Quest.